There is a fair and accurate way to analyze Islam. In fact, Dr. Stephen Shoemaker has used Bruce Lincoln's even-handed research methodology in his book, Creating the Qur'an, which is his way of producing a new historical critical analysis of Islam. Today we're going to talk about a list of theses that a Bruce Lincoln, whom Dr. Shoemaker have basically referenced or quoted, these steps, or at least different theses that Lincoln is talking about on how to conduct a research. With me here, of course, to unpack all of that for us is Dr. J. Smith. Dr. Smith, thank you again for being here. And we closed last time by talking about methodology. Now we're going to at least highlight a methodology in terms of doing a critical study.
Yeah, so we gave the criticism of both extremes. They're too extreme, either on the right or the left. You don't want to just speak and do a study from within so that's acceptable to believers. At the same time, you don't just want to do a secular study that is not acceptable to believers. You want to do something in between. So what is that? Well, he actually pushes forward Bruce Lincoln's thesis. So I have 13 theses. We're going to go through only 5 of them. These are the 5 most important. The number one is this: what person, group, or institution is responsible for a text? So you start out by saying, hold on, who is the author? What is the author? Where is he coming from? What is his audience? What is the context that he's speaking about? And for whose interests is he speaking? What is the agenda? They all have an agenda. And what will they win or lose by writing this text? So if you look at the Qur'an, those are perfectly legitimate questions to ask. Who is the author? Who is his audience? What's the context? Why did he even need to write it? What will he win or lose by writing it? Does he have an agenda? These are perfectly legitimate questions to ask. You do that when you meet a person. You do that when you look at a movie. You do that when you're given a contract. You ask these questions. These are natural questions. If we do that in daily life, why shouldn't we also be asking that of something as important as a scripture that is the foundation for almost 2 billion people around the world, and has supposedly been around for 1,400 years, as we're going to see, not 1,400 years. So that's the first thesis that he would put out there. Any comeback that you have? Did you like that? Would you agree with that?
Well, I mean, there is a lot of validity here, of course. When you want to do a research, you want to at least make sure that your research is helpful to others. So like you said, if I'm introducing you to someone, I need to know something about your background, your history. Therefore, I'm giving the true information to the other person so that when they meet you or begin to interact with you, first they know where you're coming from, they understand your background, and that would help them also appreciate the stance that you're taking.
Okay, so that's number one. Number two, since reverence is religious, scholarly virtue is the more important here. So he does agree with Shoemaker, and Shoemaker was very critical of Cantwell Smith on this, because that you must use reverence, you must only do it from within a believer's environment, from his presuppositions. Don't confront that. He said, no. Scholarly virtue is much more important than that. We need to go beyond that. Don't just negate it. Don't throw it out. Don't confront just his reverence for it. But at the same time, if it hurts their sensibilities, you still got to say it.
That's right. I mean, you are, as a scholar, sharing what you have discovered, right? So You discovered in the Quran that it talks about certain thing. Why would I suppress that? That's what the Quran is saying.
Listen, we know that better than anybody else, because almost everything that's been critical of the Bible, it's been some of the accusations have been very nasty, and we still take it. Jesus took it. He took on all kinds of criticism, and he allowed that criticism to exist, and he still forgave them on the cross for even crucifying him. So we do that. It's important that we get beyond that, get thicker skins, nonetheless stick to the historical critique. Number 3, permit criticism of one's own religion, but not the other, suggests displays defensiveness as well as Western imperialism guilt. And this is a real criticism of Smith. Yeah, you can criticize us. You can criticize Christianity, which he doesn't represent anyways. He's very critical of Christianity himself. And so do most Western scholars. They almost hate Christianity. So therefore, feel free. It's open season on Christianity, but do not touch Islam. Don't be that don't say anything critical of Islam because there's something different about Islam. Maybe because they're poor, maybe because they're different, because the fact that they're the other, whatever there's a reason, don't touch Islam. That shows a huge defensiveness from the get-go. So you can see that that is a criteria that that pitfall we must not fall into.
That's correct. Yeah.
Number 4. Assuming that all cultures, were stable with discrete values, symbols, and shared practices, when in reality, their internal tensions, conflicts, turbulence, and incoherence, as well as permeability and malleability are largely erased. This is what Karen Armstrong does. Karen Armstrong, we've talked about her before, who did this biography of Muhammad, and she only wrote about that which she loved about Muhammad.
That's right. She discounted other parts, but she picked only what suits her own feelings.
The noblemen of women. I would love to know. I mean, when you read it, you just see she picked and chose. She didn't at all deal with Maryam. She didn't all deal with Aisha. She didn't all deal with Zainab. She completely walked away from these what we call bad breath areas of Muhammad's life and only kept to the sanitized period. And also, she almost had this view of the noble savage. This is typical of a lot of Western researchers. When they leave their own environment, which they hate themselves, and they go to another environment, they fall in love with that environment, that culture, and they see them as a noble savage, and they don't use the words. In fact, they wouldn't even use that word.
Right.
But by doing that, they're almost looking and desiring that there is something gorgeous and beautiful about the other. We have it's called the syndrome. What is it called? The Stockholm Syndrome.
Yeah.
That is typical of this. I've seen this with Peace Corps workers. When we were in Africa, they'd come over to Africa, and we were living there in Senegal. And the first year, they just were in love with everything they saw, everything they touched. Everything was beautiful and so much nicer here than what their own environment. After about 2 years, they were emaciated and they were sick. And they had all these diseases because they assumed that they could live like the others there, and they couldn't. They just didn't have they couldn't withstand they didn't have the immunities to it. And we saw this happen over and over and over again. And this is one thing that's happening with a lot of Western scholars. I assume this is what Smith is. He just had a love for the other more so than his own environment, his own culture. And he assumed that all cultures were equally valid without thinking, no, there are some real problems in many cultures. There's some real difficulties. We could go into a whole list of them. And then number 5, the scholars' informants. Be aware of the scholars' informants because they tend to come from the dominant faction or caste of that culture. And this is a typical problem that I've seen over and over again. And that is whenever you're looking to see who is it that represents Islam, be careful who those representatives are. Right. We see this all the time here in the United States. I talk to my friends, or I talk to whole crowds, and I say that Islam has some real problems. It is a very violent religion. And suddenly, someone raises their hand and says, yes, but my greengrocer down there, he's the most beautiful man in the world, and he's a Muslim. Therefore, I reject what you're saying. Islam is not violent because my greengrocer is not violent. And that's true. That usually the people who come over here, the Muslims I meet here in America, are the best people in the world.
I remember a scholar from the University of Chicago one time confronted me when I was talking about what Islam teaches and why there is this tension between the peaceful side of Islam and the violent side of Islam. And I was just sharing from the Quran. Here is what the Quran says. Here is where people get the idea of violence. Here is what people get the idea about peace. That yes, there is abrogation and things like that. And then a scholar, apparently a scholar at the University of Chicago, stood up and says, that's not true because I wrote about the peaceful side of Islam and I disagree with the abrogation doctrine. I mean, this guy who knows nothing about Islam other than his own research discredited my own experience of Islam, the doctrine of abrogation that is Quranic. We studied this actually, an-nasikh wal-mansukh. I mean, we studied this back home. And like you said, watering down things, focus only on one thing. He probably got his information from his informants as well.
I had a personal experience back in 1990s. I did a debate at the Oxford Union with Benazir Bhutto, who used to be the Prime Minister of Pakistan. Mm-hmm. So she was opposing me on whether or not Islam is violent and whether it's relevant for the 20th century. And she got up and says, look at me, I'm relevant. I walk like you, I talk, eat, drink, I do everything you do. I live in London, therefore I'm relevant, therefore Islam is relevant. And I got up and I said, I kind of laughed at her and I said, Bibi, that's her name for short. I said, You walk and talk. I'm glad you feel relevant, but you eat like me. You can eat pork like I can eat pork. You drink like me. You can drink wine like I can drink wine. I'd like you to get on television right now and go to Pakistan and tell the whole Pakistan people, now you can eat pork, you can drink wine because I tell you can do so. I said, you may say that in this audience and everybody will believe you. And you will be the paradigm that they will model and they will emulate and say, this is true Islam. And they would love that type of Islam, but that's not what this book says. You know very good and well that is not Islam. Don't call that Islam. Call it Buddhism. Call it, give your own name to it. But that's not Islam. And this is typical of the fallacy that we fall into. And this is exactly what Bruce Lincoln's trying to warn us about.
Well, that's wonderful. Thank you for highlighting all of this. What's next for our audience?
We're going to go and we're going to talk about how the Quran was actually compiled. Now we're going to start looking at the compilation itself. Now we're getting into the nitty-gritty, and we're going to follow what Shoemaker says. He has lots of theories. Some of it you may agree with, some of it you may not agree with. Let's run with him. Let's see what he says. He's going to get back to what the whole title of the book is. How in the world was this book created?
Wonderful. Thank you so much, brother. Thank you, everyone. This is Fadi. Until next time, have a blessed day. Thank you for watching this video. Be sure to like and subscribe to our channel CIRA International and click on the bell so that you receive notifications whenever we publish a new video or go live. I would also like to appeal to you to consider becoming a Patreon patron by clicking the link right below. By doing so, you can give towards the production of these videos. There are also other options for you where you can give to our channel. I thank you from the bottom of my heart.